Greetings. This is the commentary and sermonette on the song, What Was Awaitin' Him. This is song number 196. And of my original songs, I think this is 183. I've been getting to a point where I'm deciding what songs I'm not going to record. And I was listening to a version of one of the songs I thought I might do, and I just let the cassette tape play all the way through, and it got to the very end. And there was a little chord progression I did. It's just an A and then a high G and then back to a D. And I had one line and it said, when he came into Jerusalem. And then I was trying to do a second line and I couldn't make it out, it's inaudible. And then I hit the other little chords and then I came back to that line again. And then the tape ended. That's all there was to it. And that'd been sometime in the early 2000s, I think, that I was recording that. Based upon some of the other songs that are on there. So I listened, I thought, gosh, when he came into Jerusalem, he knew what was awaiting him. That's all I needed to do. And then I started writing this song. So that's the first two lines. Since we're into the lyrics, might as well get with it here. Yet from shame and disgrace he hid not his face from their unlawful haste. Yes, though shame and disgrace, the king kept his place through the unrighteousness. And I kind of mess with the words a little bit to make it sound like it rhymes a little bit. Now, I am doing this commentary before I actually record the song. So I hope the words are going to stay the same, but I may tweak this a little bit when it's all said and done. But I wanted to go ahead and get this commentary started. So let's go through that first verse then. And as far as him knowing what was awaiting him, it is so clear all through the Gospels that he told the disciples over and over what was awaiting him. And they couldn't hear it. They didn't understand it until right there at the very end, some of them started getting it, that he indeed was going to be condemned and handed over the hands of sinful men. He's going to be crucified, and the third day he's going to rise again. They still didn't get it, but at least they were hearing it towards the very end, where they could at least hear what he was saying. But Jesus knew what was awaiting him. As a quick aside, as I was reading through the gospel accounts, it was clear that the things that Jesus was saying was sealing his own fate. And the disciples did see that. They knew that he was offending these people and that this was not heading in a good direction. And they tried to hold him back and warn him a few times. And Jesus rebuked Peter at one point about getting behind me, because your interest is not on God's will. Your interest is just of the flesh. But I was stumbling over that because it was like he's committing suicide. Wouldn't that be a sin? But then as you continue to read, Jesus said he did nothing on his own initiative. And actually in Isaiah, it's like his ear was opened every morning as a disciple to listen and to obey. He said the words that he speaks and the things that he's doing, that it's not on his own initiative, but as the Father has commanded him, so he's doing. It says in Hebrews that he was praying with loud crying and tears to him who was able to save him or deliver him from this hour. Yet he learned obedience through the things which he suffered. And so it was the Father's will for Jesus to confront these people the way he did, and Jesus knew where that was going to take him. And so when it comes to the trials, yet from shame and disgrace he hid not his face from their unlawful haste. I heard a guy say recently that Jesus was not convicted of anything. I don't know that I hold that completely, because when he was before Pilate, and Pilate then started hearing the charges that Jesus was a king, he asked Jesus, is it true, are you a king? He said, yes, I am a king, but my kingdom is not of this world, because if it was, my servants would be fighting. So the trap that Pilate was in was that Jesus did declare himself as a king. And so when he came out that final time, still trying to release him, the Jews were saying, we only have one king, Caesar. And the insinuation is, how many kings do you have, Pilate? And they had reported on Pilate to Rome on two separate occasions, and Rome rebuked Pilate. So these Jews, they'd go tattle to Caesar that Pilate was allowing another king. So he was, quote, convicted on that, but Pilate knew that these people were operating out of envy and he's still trying to release him. And that's why he wound up washing his hands and said, I find no guilt in this man. So he wasn't convicted, but in a sense he was, because you couldn't allow another king to be running free on the land, especially if other things might happen where Jesus' power and notoriety would be growing more than it already was. And then they get back to Rome. So Pilate was trapped, in my view. But the unlawful haste, when Jesus was having the trial before the Sanhedrin, and particularly the chief priest, listen to this. A single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or any sin which he has committed. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. Well, there were witnesses who were accusing Jesus before the high priest. If a malicious witness rises up against a man to accuse him of wrongdoing, which these witnesses were, then both the men who have the dispute shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who will be in office in those days. So that's exactly what was happening when they brought Jesus before Caiaphas. And the judges shall investigate thoroughly. And if the witness is a false witness and has accused his brother falsely, and these were all Jews in there, Jesus and all of them, then you shall do to him, that false witness, just as he had intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you, and the rest will hear and be afraid, and never again do such an evil thing among you. Thus you shall not show pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So if you're a witness and you're accusing someone, and it turns out that you're found to be a false witness, that penalty you are trying to get exacted on your brother is to be exacted on you. And we were told that these witnesses, they were false witnesses, and they couldn't keep their story straight. And Caiaphas got frustrated, and he just stood up and he said, tell us plainly, are you the Christ? And when Jesus said, I am, Caiaphas tore his garment, saying, what further need do we have of witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy yourself. Now the reason, again, an unlawful haste that this was in, the priest, who is the highest among his brothers, that have been Caiaphas, on whose head the anointing oil has been poured, and who has been consecrated to wear the garments, shall not uncover his head, nor tear his clothes. Caiaphas tore his clothes. I think the reason that would be such an offense is because that shows emotion. I mean, raging emotion. And to do that, what are the chances that you're actually thinking logically? And these judges were told, if a witness comes forward, they're to investigate thoroughly what these charges were, which means cool mindset, just the facts, ma'am, not this emotional response. So for Caiaphas to tear his garments, anybody in that Sanhedrin, that 70 elder group, should have known this guy was completely out of bounds. And also these false witnesses, they needed to be investigated thoroughly. Everything needed to be halted to nail them. So that's why I said that from the shame and disgrace, Jesus, he hid not his face from their unlawful haste. There's a lot more to it than just that. The violations of the law of Moses abounded during this whole process. And then I say, yes, through shame and disgrace, the king kept his place. Jesus didn't back down, didn't cower down. He asked questions at different points along the way. He made statements along the way, but he wasn't defending himself. He wasn't trying to straighten them out in terms of their process and procedure and even show them how they were violating the law of Moses that they supposedly were exercising. So he kept his place through the unrighteousness. As some further evidence of how out of control the whole group against Jesus was Pilate, who didn't want anything to do with their religious stuff. Here's what we're told in Mark. He was aware that the chief priests had delivered him up because of envy. Now, this thing about envy, I'm not sure I'm correct about this, but jealousy and envy It's two different words. And I think that jealousy is more of an outburst, you might say, whereas envy, I think, carries more of a demeanor or a disposition. This one commentator, he says that the word for envy is a state of ill will towards someone because of some real or presumed advantage experienced by such a person. Envy is more of a underlying disposition that is just always there, and then the jealousy of more of the actions that will come forth, spring out of it. It's almost the same thing with the word for wrath and anger. Orge is the word for wrath. It's more of a disposition, constant ill will. And then thumos is like explosions, which would be like outbursts of anger, things like that. So regardless, Pilate could even see what was going on with these people. And when you've got somebody operating out of envy or jealousy, there's no way that they're thinking correctly. Same thing with somebody that's in constant state of wrathfulness. They're not going to be reasonable. Emotions are driving them, and they're not able to really think with any objectivity. And I think that's part of the reason why this would have been such a travesty, the entire episode. And it wasn't lost on everybody. Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, they saw all this too. Let's get on to verse 2. When he came into Jerusalem, he knew what was awaiting him. I changed those two lines. I do it simply on the first and third verse, and then I add the extra words in there on the second and fourth time. So this time I've added in there. Yet the lies and deceit stood incomplete and fell at his feet. Yes, the lies and deceit with truth could not compete and had to fall at his feet. So all of these charges against him, the lies and deceit, he wasn't defending himself against this. But before truth, which is him, could not compete and had to fall at his feet. So that was just more reference of what was going on in those trials. Accusations that went nowhere. It's like an ant trying to attack a mountain of steel. The ant isn't going to get anywhere against a mountain of steel. These lies and deceit didn't make any headway and fell before him. Then I do a break, and now I come into verse 3. When he came into Jerusalem, he knew what was awaiting him. When granted power, evil won its hour, only soon to cower. Yes, it had its hour, unleashed its power, only soon to cower. When Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane and had prayed and then was coming forth, Jesus said, "Whom is it you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he said, "I am he." And when he said that, they all fell down on the ground. And then when they all scrambled back up, he said, "If I'm the one you're after, let these go their way." So he was commanding everything that happened, even in the arrest. And also, Malchus had his ear cut off by Peter, and Jesus healed that ear right on the spot. So Jesus was in full control even though this was happening. And he said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come against him, it was more than just the officers of the temple. These were Jewish officers that came. It wasn't the Romans at this point. But the chief priests were with him and elders who had come against him. And he said, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as against a robber? While I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this hour and the power of darkness are yours." He's saying, you're coming out at night, clubs, everything. I was daily in the temple and you didn't lay hands on me. Why not? Well, because the people, particularly with what he had done with raising Lazarus from the dead, that was like the one that made this explode in terms of people knew that this has to be the Messiah. And when he came into Jerusalem, that crowd that greeted him, do not believe that those individuals a few days later are yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him." The chief priests and these guys, they had their own mob. And they did this at night when all of Jesus' followers, as far as the people that had welcomed him into the city, they're all scattered who knows where. His disciples wind up scattering And these trials take place, and by 9 a.m., Jesus is on the cross. He had been arrested in the garden. He went before Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, and then before Caiaphas, I think, and then they brought him to Pilate, and then when Pilate heard that this was a Galilean, he sent him to Herod in another part of the city. Herod did his thing and couldn't get anything out, sent him back to Pilate, and then he was scourged, and then the Jews are all there again, and then there's a big thing happened with Pilate as far as the final parts of this. There's all of this activity that went on, and by 9 a.m., Jesus is physically on the cross. So this stuff happened in the dark of night. And that crowd yelling for him to be crucified would have been the mob that the Antichrist people, the religious leaders, had. And one reason that I'm absolutely convinced of that is because even early on, when Jesus healed the man that's born blind and the parents were brought in and asked, "Is this your son?" They didn't want to answer that because they knew they could be kicked out of the synagogue. So these guys were so set against Jesus that all the people knew it, and they were going to get him because this is not the Messiah that they were wanting. They wanted deliverance from Rome, and this guy did not fit the bill. We're also told in Isaiah that he had no stately form or majesty that we should look on him, and there'd be an appearance we'd be attracted to. I don't think they liked his looks. I think they hated everything about him. And so, because of that, this crowd, their mob, by them obeying as the chief priests would stir them up, that was just like being good church members and staying in good standing. That would be an opportunity for them. The other people, they had already decided, if I get kicked out, I get kicked out by these guys, because they were looked on as the accursed, uneducated masses that were deceived by this deceiver. And all his miracles, everything he did was by the power of the devil. So the reason that they didn't arrest him when he was in the temple, they were afraid of the people. They knew that there was more of them than there was of them, even in the temple. So that's why Jesus challenged them there. But he says, "This hour and the power of darkness are yours." Now, one thing on this, when I say evil won its hour, yes, it unleashed its power. Well, Satan entered Judas on 2 occasions. So Satan is involved in this, but I didn't want to single him out because Judas was culpable. Jesus said when he was identifying that there was a betrayer, it had been good for him if he had never been born, but he was born. And Judas was responsible and accountable for what he did, even though on 2 occasions Satan entered him. The first time was to go and make the deal with the chief priests on betraying him, and the second time was to actually do it. And even then, when Jesus identified it, gave him the morsel, he said to Judas, "What you do, do quickly." Satan had entered him, and he left, and it was night. All this done under the cover of night. That's why I said, when granted power, evil won its hour. It was Satan, and it was evil men. It's all of it. It's a combination of all of it. Only soon to cower. Well, that's a precursor to the resurrection. Yes, it had its hour, unleashed its power, only soon to cower. I was telling a guy the other day, I believe that Jesus was in the best physical condition of anybody that's ever been on the planet, except maybe Adam when he was first created and no sin was in the world and he was in his innocence. Jesus was in his prime, and he'd been walking for 3+ years, and he was in tremendous physical condition. And because of the eternal consequences of what was happening here, for Satan in particular, he was granted the opportunity to attack Jesus, and his sole goal was to get Jesus to sin. And in the temptation in the wilderness, he tried 3 things and didn't work, and he said he departed for an opportune time. He departed and he was looking for another opportunity. And when the hedges came down by God the Father, where Jesus was placed in the hands of man, Satan would have been involved in that, but that was a death that I believe was designed to be the maximum amount of pressure for as long as possible to try to get Jesus to sin. I mean, if he'd simply been beheaded, it'd just been over that quick. This was Satan's opportunity to try to get Jesus to fail. But the men that were involved in it gladly were wanting to do it. In fact, the Romans, a lot of them be like, we're in the armpit of the Roman Empire with these Jews, and now we got one here. And they took delight in beating him and mocking him and putting a purple robe on him and a crown of thorns and all the rest of it they did. And then the chief priests were glad to let them do all the dirty work, and they're at the cross mocking him and challenging him. And for 6 hours he was there. And even with this unleashing its power, God the Father made it clear that no bone could be broken. But it says Jesus was marred more than any man. I think you wouldn't have even been able to recognize him between the beating and the scourgings and all the rest, all designed to be the maximum amount of harm for as long as could be possible, to try to get Jesus to curse or outbursts of anger, any number of things. Just one sin is all Satan was after. And that power was granted him, and he used it to the max. So soon to cower, to back up just a minute, when Jesus was on the cross, he was turned into sin, because death would not have a legal right to him. It's only because of sin that death has a legal right to any of us. So when Jesus was turned into sin, God the Father says, well, pleased to crush him, putting him to grief, to where he's paying for those sins, because the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I require life or blood to pay for wrongdoing. Well, when Jesus was on the cross, he became a curse for us. All of our sins were placed upon him. And the moment he died, the sin has been paid for that was imputed on him. And now he's on the other side of death's door with no sin. And he's always been righteous, and he was standing there righteous. And at that point, Jesus won an eternal battle. He who hates me loves death. Talking about wisdom, which is him. With that victory that Jesus achieved, at a minimum, death is in its death throes. But there was definitely some changes that happened the moment Jesus died. At that point, if Satan ever thought he might have a way out, that sealed it. That forever meant there was no way out. He could not and did not succeed in getting Jesus to sin. Then I go into the last verse. When he came into Jerusalem, he knew what was awaiting him. Yet for my darkness to end, I needed a friend with an almighty hand. Yes, for my darkness to end, he knew I needed him to be my Passover lamb. And then I do a little bit of a break, and I end with, yes, for my darkness to end, he knew I needed him to be my Passover lamb. So when he was coming into Jerusalem, he knew what was waiting him. All the injustice, all the suffering, the cross itself. Yet he knew this was also awaiting him. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you may not grow weary and lose heart. For you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin. Jesus knew what was awaiting him, that he would be the Passover lamb, and that was a joy that we can be forgiven and pardoned. I almost thought I wasn't going to say my Passover lamb. He knew I needed him to be my Passover lamb. But in Exodus, as far as the Passover is concerned, and listen to this. This is going to be the last plague that God was going to send on Egypt, and this is what they were commanded to do. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month they are each one to take a lamb for each household. A little later, moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat. So this would have been on the two sides and the top of the door. And he says, the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood of that lamb which is on the basin, and apply it, some of it, the blood that is in the basin, to the lintel and the two doorposts. And none of you shall go outside of the door of the house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to smite you. We're in Christ. He's our Passover lamb. He's my Passover lamb. This is a transaction that happens between the individual and Christ himself. And when the blood is seen on us, the blood of the lamb, then we will be passed over in terms of the wrath of God the Father, and actually the wrath of the Son. And again, the Passover lamb be unblemished, spotless, and Jesus was unblemished and spotless, no unrighteousness in him, no guile, nothing, never did anything wrong. And although he was slaughtered like the lamb to the slaughter, no bone could be broken, and it wasn't. So for my darkness to end, he knew I needed him to be my Passover lamb. And coming to him as a living stone, rejected by men but choice and precious in the sight of God, you also as living stones, allow yourselves to be built up, or build yourself up into a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices accepted to God through Jesus Christ. We're all part of a royal priesthood. We're all priests to God, and we need to be functioning in that role. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, just means set apart, a people for God's own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. For my darkness to end, he knew I needed him to be my Passover lamb. That's the long and short of it. So when he came into Jerusalem, he knew what was awaiting him. He sure did. And he was obedient to the point of death, even the death of a cross, knowing that on the other side a joy was set before him of me, you, us. For some reason, we're worth it to him. That is a mystery to me. Well, I want to thank you for listening. Like I always say, listen to these matters, and you will learn great and mighty things that you haven't known. And these things lead to life, and you will indeed live.